In 371 BC, on the plain of Leuctra, a sound rolled across the earth that every Greek alive had learned to dread. Not the scream of barbarians, not the chaos of a mob charge. Something worse, a rhythm. 1,700 bronze shields slamming together in unison. Thousands of sandaled feet hitting dry ground at the exact same moment. And cutting through it all, the thin, cold shriek of bone flutes. That sound had carried the same message for 300 years, from one end of Greece to the other. The battle was already over. You just hadn't died yet. No army in living memory had stood against the Spartan Phalanx in open ground and survived. It wasn't a fight. It was a ritual, a death sentence delivered in formation. Sparta had built itself into something more than a city. It was a religion of violence, a society that believed its soldiers had crossed some line that separated men from weapons. And for 3 centuries, nobody proved them wrong. But today, on this unremarkable stretch of Boeotian dirt, that 300-year truth is about to become a lie. Before the shadows grow long, a Spartan king will bleed out in the dust, and the most terrifying military force the ancient world has ever known will be dismantled in a single afternoon. The man responsible doesn't have more soldiers. He doesn't have better equipment. He doesn't have divine favor or some secret alliance. His name is Epaminondas of Thebes, and the only advantage he carries onto that field is the one thing Sparta never bothered to guard against. He could think differently. Every general in Greece looked at the Spartan line and saw an unstoppable wall of red cloaks and hammered bronze. Epaminondas looked at the same wall and saw a pattern, a habit, a flaw that had been hiding in plain sight for generations, protected not by strategy, but by the simple fact that everyone was too terrified to look closely. The Spartan Phalanx wasn't divine. It was a system, and every system has a breaking point. He just had to find the nerve to press it. While every other commander in Greece would rather surrender than face Sparta on open terrain, this man designed an attack so unorthodox that his own officers thought he had lost his mind. So the real question here isn't whether an underdog can pull off an upset. The real question cuts much deeper than that. How did one man weaponize devotion, desperation, and pure tactical audacity into something sharp enough to shatter a myth that had terrorized an entire civilization? How did he engineer a battle so devastating that the Spartans who lived through it wished they hadn't? And what happens to a nation that has staked its entire identity on being unbeatable the moment the world watches its warriors break, bleed, and run like everyone else? Stay with me, because we are about to take apart the day a mortal killed a god. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me what city and country you're watching from right now. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and help us keep building. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. Every soul standing on that plain already knew the ending. It had been written 100 times before. On one side, Thebes and its Boeotian partners, a coalition that had only just torn itself free from Spartan domination. On the other, the undisputed masters of organized killing in the Greek world. Sparta had brought everything. Their king, Cleombrotus, hundreds of Spartiates, full-blooded citizens raised from birth for exactly this moment. Thousands of allied heavy infantry. And behind all of it, the crushing psychological mass of 300 years of unbroken supremacy. Ask anyone in Greece that morning what was about to happen, and they would have given you the same answer without hesitation. This was not going to be a contest. It was going to be a demonstration. To understand why that confidence was so absolute, you have to forget the myths and look at the mechanics. Greek combat in this era revolved around one thing: the hoplite phalanx. Rows of armored men, each one carrying a broad round shield strapped to his left arm and gripping a long spear in his right. They packed in tight, close enough that your shield didn't just protect you. It covered the exposed side of the man standing to your left. Shoulder against shoulder. Bronze against bronze. The front ranks became a moving barricade of wood and metal, and the ranks behind them leaned forward, driving the whole mass ahead with sheer physical weight. This was not a style of war that rewarded individual bravery. It rewarded cohesion, timing, nerve. If the wall held, you walked away. If it cracked, you were trampled. Every major Greek city could assemble some version of this formation. Athens drilled it, Corinth fielded it, Argos fought with it, but Sparta perfected it. Spartan boys were ripped from their homes as children and fed into the agoge, a training system designed not to educate, but to strip away everything soft and rebuild what was left into a functioning piece of a war machine. They learned to march in step before they learned to read. By the time a Spartan man took his place in the phalanx, he was not simply a soldier standing in a line. He was a gear in an engine that did one thing and did it without mercy: advance, compress, and destroy whatever was in front of it. But every engine has a design flaw, and the phalanx carried one baked into its bones. That heavy shield, locked onto the left arm, left the right side of every soldier's body feeling naked. It was instinct. You couldn't train it out. Every man in the line unconsciously pressed a little closer to the shield of the man on his right, looking for cover that wasn't quite there. The man beside him did the same, and the man beside him. Multiply that tiny flinch across a line of 1,000 men, and the effect became enormous. As the phalanx marched forward, the entire formation drifted to the right, like a ship pulled by an invisible current. Greek generals had been dealing with this drift for generations. Some tried to anchor their vulnerable flank against a hill or a river. Others placed their steadiest veterans on the side most likely to buckle. But most commanders treated it the way farmers treat rain. You couldn't stop it. You planned around it. You hoped the damage would be manageable. Sparta didn't manage the drift. Sparta weaponized it. Instead of fighting that natural pull to the right, they built their entire battle doctrine around it. The Spartan king always took his position on the far right of the formation, exactly where the drift would push hardest and fastest. Surrounding him stood the royal bodyguard and the most seasoned killers in the army. So the point of the phalanx that was already engineered by physics to strike first and deepest was also loaded with the most dangerous men on the field. Every time the line moved forward, that right wing became a battering ram swinging into the enemy's left flank with devastating, almost mechanical precision. And the results were horrifyingly consistent. Battle after battle, the same script played out. The Spartan right, stacked with elite warriors, slammed into the opposing left wing, which was almost never where the enemy placed their best troops. Those men were usually on their own right flank, fighting the weaker Spartan allies in a more balanced contest. So the decisive collision always happened where Sparta was strongest and the enemy was weakest. The opposing left would buckle, then shatter. Then the Spartans would wheel inward, rolling down the exposed side of the enemy line like a door swinging shut. It became legend. It became expectation. It became a kind of gravity that no one in Greece seemed able to escape. And that was the nightmare staring Epaminondas in the face at Leuctra. The terrain offered nothing to hide behind: no gorge, no fortress wall, no narrow pass that could neutralize Spartan discipline. If both armies simply lined up in the traditional way and walked into each other, Sparta would execute the same playbook it had executed for a century. Their right wing, packed with Cleombrotus and his guard, would carve through the Theban left like a blade through linen. And after that, the rest would be cleanup. Epaminondas saw all of this with a clarity that bordered on obsession. He was not a general who led with volume or spectacle. People in Thebes described him as something rare, a man equally at home debating philosophy and drilling infantry, someone who studied war the way a surgeon studies anatomy. He had spent years watching Sparta operate. He knew their history, their rituals, and the aura of invincibility that paralyzed every army that lined up against them. But where everyone else saw an unbreakable force, Epaminondas saw something far more useful. He saw a habit. The Spartans didn't adapt because they had never needed to. Their dominance had calcified their tactics into ritual. And ritual, no matter how lethal, is predictable. That morning, though, the greatest threat to his plan wasn't standing across the field in red cloaks. It was standing right behind him in his own ranks. The Boeotian allies Thebes had dragged into this confrontation were barely holding together. Many of them had watched other cities get ground into dust by Spartan phalanxes, and they had no appetite for being next. Whispers moved through the camp like poison. Maybe they should pull back to better ground. Maybe they should negotiate. There were even rumors that some allied contingents were preparing to abandon the field entirely before a single spear was thrown. Epaminondas was being crushed from two directions at once. In front of him, the most efficient killing machine in the ancient world. Behind him, an army dissolving under the weight of its own terror. If his coalition fractured before the fight started, Sparta wouldn't even need to swing a sword. And if he arranged his men in the standard formation, a long, even line against a long, even line, he would simply be feeding Theban bodies into a machine that had been digesting Greek armies for 300 years. He needed to break the pattern, not just the Spartan formation, the stories Sparta had told about itself, the myth that made armies surrender before the first blow landed. He started with the one weakness everyone acknowledged, but nobody had the nerve to exploit: the drift. If Sparta's line always pulled right, and if the king always commanded that right wing, then the geometry of every battle was predetermined. The hottest, most violent point of contact would always be the same corner of the field. And for generations, every opposing general had responded the same way. Keep your best troops away from that kill zone. Why sacrifice your finest men against the strongest section of the Spartan army? Put them somewhere safer. Use them against weaker opponents. It was logical, it was sensible, and it was exactly why Sparta kept winning. Epaminondas decided to invert the logic entirely. Instead of spreading his strength evenly across the line like a thin coat of paint, he imagined concentrating almost everything into a single point. Not the standard 12 ranks deep. Something grotesquely thicker. A column so dense and so heavy that when it hit, it would generate a force the Spartan right had never been designed to absorb. Instead of a wall, he would build a fist, and he would aim that fist directly at the throat of the Spartan army. King Cleombrotus and his royal guard. The cost of this idea was immediate and brutal. To build that kind of mass on his left wing, he had to hollow out the rest of his line. His center would be thin. His right would be skeletal. If those sections tried to fight a conventional phalanx engagement, they would be overwhelmed in minutes. This was not a balanced battle plan. It was a controlled demolition. Everything depended on one strike landing before the rest of the structure collapsed. As Epaminondas studied the ground at Leuctra, he layered another violation of convention onto his design. He did not want both lines to crash together simultaneously the way every Greek battle had worked for centuries. He wanted a staggered impact. The massively reinforced Theban left would advance fast and hit first, driving into the Spartan right before the rest of the field had even made contact. His weakened center and right would advance slower, deliberately lagging behind, buying time rather than seeking collision. Instead of one uniform clash stretching across the entire plain, there would be a single concentrated explosion on one flank, while the rest of the battle still hung in the air. To any experienced Greek officer, this looked like insanity. If your center and right were still approaching while your left was already locked in combat, the enemy could exploit those gaps. They could wheel around your flanks. They could collapse your thin sections before your main attack accomplished anything. And if your reinforced left failed to break through, you had nothing left to fall back on. The whole army would unravel. Epaminondas knew every one of those risks. He also knew that playing by the established rules guaranteed defeat. The only way to beat a system that ran on predictable inputs was to feed it something it had never processed before. For the Spartan machine, that something would be total, overwhelming force concentrated on the one point they considered impenetrable. His officers pushed back. His allied commanders demanded reassurance. They wanted to hear about numerical advantages, hidden reserves, some concrete edge that would tilt the odds. But the numbers offered no comfort. The two armies were roughly matched in total strength, and by some estimates, Sparta may have even held a slight advantage in manpower. What Epaminondas possessed was not a bigger army. It was a willingness to bend the geometry of battle in a way no one had ever attempted against Sparta. Explaining that to terrified men on the eve of combat was a different kind of war entirely. He began reshaping the formation. On the left, he pulled together the best Thebes had to offer, the city's finest hoplites, and at the tip of that mass, the unit that would carve its name into history before the day was over, the Sacred Band. He stacked rank behind rank behind rank until the column reached a depth that would have looked absurd to any conventional tactician. Behind the Sacred Band, wave after wave of Theban citizens and allied fighters compressed into a battering mass pointed at a single target. This was no longer a wing of an army. It was a siege weapon in human form, designed to punch through one specific section of the enemy line and kill the man standing at its center. The center and right, meanwhile, were stretched thin and given a task that went against every fiber of their training. They were not there to win. They were there to survive long enough for the left to finish the job. From the Spartan side of the field, this strange arrangement drew contempt more than concern. The Spartans were accustomed to enemies imitating their methods, not reinventing them. They noticed the heavy Theban left and likely dismissed it as a nervous attempt to shore up a vulnerable flank. Their answer would be the same answer it had always been. Cleombrotus and his guard would do what Spartan kings had done for generations. They would drive forward, break whatever stood in front of them, and add another line to the long record of Spartan dominance. But Epaminondas had one more card to play before the infantry collided. He pushed his cavalry forward, closer to the front than convention allowed. Theban horsemen were among the best in Greece, and he intended to use them not as a sideshow, but as a disruptive force. If he could scatter the Spartan cavalry and throw the front ranks of the Spartan Phalanx into momentary chaos, even a few minutes of confusion would be enough. In a battle decided by tight formations, a brief window of disorder could create fractures that would never exist under normal conditions. Then came the order that must have felt like treason to the men who received it. After a lifetime of watching Sparta's right wing obliterate enemy flanks, every officer in the Theban army expected Epaminondas to reinforce his own right wing to compensate. Match strength against strength. Shore up the side that would face the weakest Spartan pressure so it could at least hold. Instead, Epaminondas told them to weaken the right even further. The Theban right wing would not charge forward to meet the Spartan left. It would hang back. It would refuse engagement. It would surrender ground rather than lock shields. The center would do something similar, drifting forward without committing to a full collision. Everything except the colossal left wing would operate as a flexible screen, absorbing pressure and buying time without standing and fighting in the traditional sense. Imagine the faces of the men receiving those orders. Veterans who had spent decades training to plant their feet, lock their shields, and push forward until the enemy broke were now being told to do the opposite. Retreat without being hit. Delay without engaging. Let the enemy come and give them nothing to grab onto. To some, it sounded like cowardice dressed up as strategy. To others, it sounded like a death sentence. If the Spartans punched through those thin sections before the left wing completed its mission, the entire army would be split open and slaughtered in the gap. Stop for a moment and consider what kind of mind holds steady under that pressure. Epaminondas was not risking just his own life. He was staking the survival of Thebes, the freedom of Boeotia, and the entire political balance of Greece on a formation that every experienced soldier on that field believed was madness. If this attack collapsed, his city wouldn't just lose an army. It would lose its independence, its dignity, and probably its walls. And still, he held the course. Before we cross into the moment of impact, let me speak directly to you. If you are still here, still locked into this story, you are not just passing through. You understand that history is not a list of dates. It is the study of decisions made under impossible pressure. We built something for people who think that way. It is called the lineage, our inner circle on this channel. When you join, you are not just supporting a creator, you are standing with the core community that keeps these deep investigations alive. Members of the lineage get early access to new documentaries and become part of a group that refuses to settle for shallow history. If that sounds like you, someone who wants to understand how power actually operated in the ancient world, consider joining. Now, back to the field at Leuctra. The debate was over. The formation was set. On the Theban left, that monstrous column stood ready, 50 ranks deep, bristling with spear points, aimed like a missile at a single patch of the Spartan line. The center and right, hollowed out and trembling with the weight of what they had been asked to do, prepared for a kind of battle no Greek army had ever fought, one where survival meant resisting every instinct to charge. Across the plain, Cleombrotus tightened his grip on his shield and prepared his men for a fight he believed would unfold the way it always had, completely unaware that the enemy had redesigned the entire game around the specific way Sparta liked to play it. Epaminondas made one final pass along his front line, speaking low, measured words to the officers who would carry out the most dangerous assignments. He did not offer promises of safety. He offered them only this: if they held their nerve and executed the timing, this single afternoon could destroy the myth that had held Greece in chains for longer than any living man could remember. Then he took his place on the left, among the men tasked with the most violent work of the day. Their objective was singular and terrifying. March into the strongest point of the Spartan line, reach the king, and kill the idea that Sparta could not be broken. The bone flutes began to sound. Dust lifted from the dry earth. Across the plain, both armies started to move, and in that thin, suspended moment, before feet left the mark and bronze met bronze, Epaminondas gave the command that must have sent ice through the veins of half his army. The right wing was to fall back. The center was to slow its advance. And the Theban left, packed 50 ranks deep and burning with something fiercer than discipline, was to march straight at the Spartan king without stopping. They were not going to sidestep the killing ground. They were going to walk directly into its center. And as the first ranks closed the distance and the sound of the advance swelled into something no man on that field could ignore, every soldier on both sides understood the same thing at once. This was no longer a normal engagement. This was a single, concentrated attempt to destroy the heart of Spartan power in full view of the men who worshipped it. The collision that came next would determine whether Epaminondas had just rewritten the rules of war or sealed the destruction of everything he loved. The first blow at Leuctra wasn't steel against bronze. It was horses. The Theban cavalry launched forward in a tight, disciplined wave, throwing up a curtain of gritty dust that hung low over the plain. These were riders who had been drilled and sharpened over years of deliberate investment. The Spartan horsemen, by contrast, had always been an afterthought, a supporting arm that Sparta never took seriously enough to properly develop. When the two groups collided, there was nothing graceful about it. It was a violent tangle of animal muscle and human weight, and it ended the way Epaminondas needed it to end, with the Spartan riders being shoved backward, stumbling into the path of their own advancing infantry. Panicked horses wheeled and crashed against the front ranks of the Spartan Phalanx. Shields were jarred. The steady marching cadence broke apart for a handful of seconds as hoplites dodged and steadied themselves around thrashing animals. Cleombrotus watched the disruption ripple through his front line and waited for his men to reset. They would. They always did. But those few seconds of disorder were not accidental. They were purchased, and they would cost Sparta everything. Because while the Spartan front was still recovering its footing, the real weapon arrived. At the leading edge of the Theban column stood the unit that would earn a kind of immortality before the sun moved another inch across the sky. The Sacred Band. 300 fighters, 30 files of 10, positioned at the very point of the deepest formation anyone on that field had ever seen. But what made the Sacred Band different from every other elite unit in Greece was not their armor, their training, or their numbers. It was who they fought beside. Each man in the Sacred Band was paired with his lover. Ancient sources do not soften this or speak around it. The unit was built on romantic bonds between men, and the reasoning behind that design was as cold and practical as anything Sparta ever invented. A soldier might abandon a comrade to save himself. He might break under fear and choose survival over honor. But would he turn and run knowing that the man he loved was still standing in the front rank, exposed, about to be cut down alone? Would he drop his shield while the person who shared his life was being trampled into the dirt 3 feet away? The Thebans wagered everything on the answer being no. And that wager transformed the Sacred Band into something Sparta's training could not replicate. Spartan discipline was institutional. It was beaten into boys and hardened into men through years of collective suffering. The Sacred Band's cohesion was personal. Each pair of fighters formed its own closed circuit of devotion. Each file of 10 contained several of these bonds, layered and interlocked. This was not merely a military formation. It was a structure held together by the most powerful adhesive human beings possess: the refusal to let someone you love die while you still draw breath. And behind the Sacred Band rose the true horror of Epaminondas' invention: mass. A standard Greek phalanx deployed 8 to 12 ranks deep. 12 was considered heavy, enough weight to sustain a prolonged push without wasting the rear ranks. Epaminondas had swollen his left wing to roughly 50 ranks, 50 rows of armored men, shield pressed against the back of the man ahead, spear angled over the shoulder of the row in front, all of them compressed into a single battering column aimed at one target. Picture it from the perspective of a man standing in the front row of that formation. Ahead of you, the most dangerous soldiers the ancient world has ever produced. Behind you, 49 rows of your countrymen driving forward with the combined momentum of a landslide. You cannot stop. You cannot step back. Even if terror floods every nerve in your body, the sheer weight of the men behind you makes retreat physically impossible. You are a projectile. The men behind you are the force that launched you, and the target is the king of Sparta. Across the gap, the Spartan line still looked magnificent. Red cloaks snapping in the breeze, bronze catching the light, the bone flutes still singing their cold, ancient melody. Cleombrotus had stood on fields like this before. He had felt the familiar pull of the drift, the steady rightward creep of the formation, the gradual acceleration into contact. Everything about this moment felt like repetition. He expected to meet the Theban left the way Spartan kings had always met enemy flanks. Absorb the impact, hold steady, then grind forward until the other side shattered. But something in the geometry was wrong. The Theban center and right were not advancing with purpose. They seemed to linger, almost hanging in the air, as if the men in those sections had lost their nerve. To a Spartan eye, it looked like fear. It looked like an army already breaking before contact. In truth, it was the trap closing around them. The real danger was not the hesitant center. It was the massive column bearing down on Cleombrotus's flank, deeper and heavier than anything any Spartan commander had ever faced. The last seconds before collision are always the slowest. Close enough now to read the expression on the face of the man who wants to kill you. Close enough to see the white knuckles wrapped around a spear shaft. Close enough to hear individual voices cutting through the noise. The front ranks break into a jog. Not quite a sprint. Faster than a walk. The air fills with the shriek of flutes, barked commands, and the dull percussion of thousands of feet striking dry earth in near unison. Then the lines met. The first heartbeat was all spear points. Jabs aimed past the rim of shields, hunting for throats, for the soft gap beneath the arm, for any exposed flesh. Some spears shattered on impact. Others bent and jammed together in the narrow space between the two walls of men. Second-rank fighters leaned their weapons over the shoulders of the front line, stabbing blind, thrusting at anything that moved. This was the brutal, close-quarters reality of hoplite combat. Not a duel, but a grinding exchange of stabs and shoves, where the goal was simple. Keep your wall intact. Break theirs. But at Leuctra, the normal rhythm of that exchange lasted only moments before something far more terrifying took over. The crush. 50 ranks of men drove forward. The rear ranks, blind to what was happening at the front, heard the order to advance and obeyed. The middle ranks felt the pressure building but could see nothing. The front ranks felt everything. They were caught between the Spartan shields ahead and the irresistible mass of their own army behind. There was no room for technique, no space for skill, only force meeting force, and one side had nearly 4 times the depth. The Spartan right held. For a breath, maybe 2. Spartan hoplites locked their shields, dug their feet into the sand, and leaned into the collision with everything their training had given them. But physics does not care about reputation. Every man in the Spartan front rank was not just fighting the soldier directly in front of him. He was absorbing the momentum of 50 rows of human weight. The pressure was not something you could match with courage. It was something that compressed your chest against your shield until your lungs could not expand. Cleombrotus felt the line shudder. The front ranks of his right wing began to lose ground, not in large dramatic steps, but in inches. Small, grinding concessions of space that added up with terrifying speed. The Spartan line was not collapsing, it was being swallowed. For every half step, a Spartan was forced backward. A Theban filled the gap. The formation that had held Greece in terror for 3 centuries began to bend inward, bowing like a beam, taking more weight than it was ever designed to carry. Inside that bowing section, a private nightmare unfolded. Men in the 2nd and 3rd ranks found themselves compressed between their own comrades and the enemy wall until they could barely move their arms. Shields jammed at wrong angles, spears locked together in useless tangles. The pressure from behind kept building as rear ranks pushed forward, unaware of the hell they were feeding into. Ribs flexed against the inside of bronze breastplates. Some men, pinned upright, began gasping for air even though no blade had touched them. At the front of it all, the sacred band refused to yield a single step. For these men, the fight carried a weight beyond tactics. They had grown up under the shadow of Spartan supremacy. Every Greek child alive had been raised on stories of Thermopylae, of Plataea, of the 100 smaller engagements where Spartan discipline crushed every army foolish enough to stand in its path. If the sacred band broke now, those stories would survive another generation. If they held, they would author a new one. Behind them, voice after voice screamed the same word: push. The Theban column became a living siege engine. The absurd depth that would have drawn mockery from any conventional tactician was now converting directly into crushing physical advantage. Instead of distributing force across a long, thin line, Epaminondas had compressed it into a single point. And that point was driving into the Spartan right wing like a spike into wood. Not because the Spartans lacked courage, not because their training failed, because the human body has a breaking point. And Epaminondas had designed a formation whose entire purpose was to find that point and push past it. The dust thickened until the sun became a dull smear overhead. Blood ran down the faces of shields and pooled in the trampled sand. Spears cracked and splintered. Men shrieked as iron points found flesh, punching through groins, faces, the soft tissue above the collarbone. But the dead did not fall. There was no room. Bodies stayed upright, pinned between the living, held in place by the same pressure that had killed them. Some men suffocated standing up, their final breaths crushed out of them by the weight of their own comrades pressing forward. And somewhere in that grinding chaos, King Cleombrotus was struck. The ancient sources differ on the details. A spear thrust, a sword blow. The exact second is lost. But they converge on the outcome. The king of Sparta, fighting in the forward ranks of his right wing as tradition demanded, was wounded so severely that he could no longer stand or command. His personal guard closed around him instantly, forming a desperate pocket of shields, trying to keep Theban spear points away from his body. In the suffocating press of the melee, orders dissolved into noise. The front rank lost any clear boundary between offense and defense. Men who had been trained since boyhood to hold formation and push forward were now fighting with one frantic, singular purpose: do not let the king's body fall into enemy hands. For Sparta, this was not simply the loss of a general. It was an attack on the foundational belief of their civilization. The king was supposed to be the living proof that Sparta did not lose in open combat. He was the embodiment of a 300-year promise. When the men around him saw blood running from his body, when they watched him sag and buckle, something deeper than a battle line began to fracture. The royal guard started pulling back, dragging the king's body with them. That small rearward motion rippled outward like a crack in glass. The files behind them sensed movement and adjusted. A controlled step became a short retreat. The Thebans, feeling the resistance soften, surged into the opening, driving forward with spears and shoulders and the accumulated fury of a people who had spent generations being told they could never win this fight. What happened next would have been unthinkable in any Greek city an hour earlier. Instead of holding their positions and fighting to stabilize the line, the Spartans closest to the king abandoned formation. Winning ceased to matter. Recovering the royal body became everything. Soldiers who should have been locking shields and holding the wall turned inward, clustering around Cleombrotus, trying to lift him, shield him, pass him backward through the ranks. Some turned their backs to the enemy to do it. For Epaminondas, watching from inside the press of his own left wing, this was the crack he had engineered the entire battle to produce. The wall was open. The sacred band and the ranks behind them drove into the breach like a flood through a broken dam. Their spears found the backs of men who had turned to protect their king. They stabbed into unguarded flanks, exposed throats, the gaps left by soldiers who had abandoned their place in the shield wall. The evacuation of Cleombrotus became a bloody knot of tangled bodies at the center of a disintegrating right wing. Some Spartans succeeded in dragging the king clear. Others were cut down where they stood, killed in the act of trying to save him. The news traveled down the Spartan line in fragments, each one more damaging than the last. Some men heard the king had fallen. Others heard only that he was wounded. Some saw the royal standard dip and assumed the worst. It did not matter which version reached them. The psychological effect was the same. For the first time within living memory, Spartan soldiers were fighting with the knowledge that their king might already be dead, and that the supposedly invincible right wing was being driven backward. On the Spartan left and center, the Allied troops began to waver. These were not Spartiates. They were men from cities that marched under Sparta's banner, some by choice, many by compulsion. Their confidence had always rested on a single assumption, that the Spartan elite on the right wing would handle the decisive fight, shatter the enemy at the critical point, and secure victory for the whole army. Now they looked toward that wing and saw dust, disorder, and the unmistakable backward movement of men being pushed off their ground. Meanwhile, the Theban center and right were executing their role with surgical precision. They were not trying to win their sections of the field. They were refusing engagement, yielding ground in slow, deliberate steps, keeping the Spartan allies occupied without ever committing to the kind of full collision that would have exposed their thin ranks. They bent without snapping. They survived minute by minute, buying time for the hammer blow on the left to finish its work. If you could somehow rise above the dust and see the battlefield from the sky, you would watch the shape of the engagement transform. The Spartan right, which should have been the leading edge of a triumphant advance, was instead a swollen, disordered mass being driven steadily backward. The deep Theban left carved into it like a wedge splitting timber. The center of the Spartan line twisted. Gaps opened between units. The clean, disciplined formation that had been the signature of Spartan warfare for 3 centuries was deforming in real time, bending and tearing under a kind of pressure it was never built to withstand. More men fell around the place where Cleombrotus had been struck. Some accounts say his body was abandoned on the ground during the worst of the fighting, recovered only later under a truce. Others describe him being carried off still breathing, only to die shortly after. For the soldiers still fighting, the distinction was meaningless. The king was gone. Whether his heart had stopped or was still beating somewhere behind the collapsing line, his presence on the field was over. The symbol around which the entire Spartan identity was organized had been broken in full view of both armies. Once that truth sank in, the battle stopped being a contest between formations and became something worse. It became a collapse of faith. On the flanks, Allied troops began peeling away. Some stepped back in measured retreat. Others turned and ran outright. They understood the arithmetic of a crumbling wing. Stay next to a broken formation, and you get rolled up from the side, surrounded and butchered. These men had not signed up to die for a myth that was bleeding out in the dirt. They were not Spartiates. They did not share the cult. And when the cult started dying, they chose to live. The phalanx came apart in sections. Some Spartan units fought on in grim, isolated clusters, refusing to retreat even as they were cut off and outnumbered. Others tried to withdraw in something resembling order, stepping backward in tight groups, shields still facing the enemy. But once cohesion is gone, discipline becomes a lonely act. The Theban spears found every gap, every exposed back, every man caught between the instinct to fight and the instinct to flee. And then, in the smoke and screaming and chaos, something happened that would have been inconceivable to any Spartan alive that morning. Some of them dropped their shields and ran. Let that settle for a moment. The entire Spartan identity was forged around a single command drilled into every boy from the day he entered the agage. Return carrying your shield or lying on it. To abandon your shield was to confess that you had deserted your brothers. You might survive the battle, but you would return home as a living ghost, stripped of honor, marked for life. And yet here, on this Boeotian plain, under the unbearable weight of the Theban left and the sight of their king's blood in the dust, a handful of Spartans chose that shame over certain death. It was not a complete rout. Many Spartans fought with suicidal stubbornness, dying where they stood rather than take a single step backward. Others managed an organized withdrawal that preserved some fragment of dignity. But none of that mattered once the story spread. The image that would travel across Greece was simple and annihilating. Spartan hoplites, in a pitched battle on open ground, with their king present and their formation intact at the start, had been broken. Not tricked in an ambush, not outmaneuvered at sea. Beaten face to face, in broad daylight, in exactly the kind of fight they had spent 300 years telling the world they could never lose. Epaminondas did not order a reckless pursuit. He had achieved what no living general thought possible. He had torn the heart out of the Spartan army, but he understood that the battle itself was only the first cut. What he did next would determine whether this was remembered as a single brilliant afternoon or the beginning of Sparta's permanent descent from the summit of Greek power. Before we move into that next phase, I want to pull you out of the dust for a moment and talk about something we rarely discuss openly on YouTube: the research. The story you are hearing right now was built on a primary backbone, a single book that goes deep into Leuctra, Sparta, and Thebes with unforgiving detail. That exact book, the one that shaped today's script, is sitting right now in the product shelf on your screen. It is not just a history book. It is a brutal archive of how myths are constructed and demolished. If you want to truly understand what happened here, you need it in your collection. And there is more waiting in that shelf. When you open it, you are not just looking at one title. You are stepping into a curated vault of dark memorabilia tied to this world. Immersive relics and grim artifacts that match the atmosphere of stories like this one. I will not spoil what is there because the inventory shifts, but if you explore, you will find them alongside our official channel collection of essential dark history books. Open the shop panel, browse while I keep talking, and turn your viewing into something you can hold. Back on the field, the dust begins to thin. The roar of clashing lines fades into the cries of the wounded and the silence of the dead. The Thebans stand on ground soaked with blood, surrounded by the wreckage of both armies. They have paid a steep price for what they accomplished. But they are on their feet, and the men who were supposed to destroy them are not. The surviving Spartans pull together in exhausted, battered groups, counting faces, searching for the men who are no longer standing. They stare at the patch of earth where their king was struck down. They know that when they begin the march home, if they are permitted to march home, nothing in their world will be the same. The aura that had protected Sparta more effectively than any wall or weapon has been punctured in front of witnesses. Every city in Greece will hear what happened here. Every subject state will recalculate. Every ally will reconsider. Epaminondas now faces a decision that will define not just his legacy, but the shape of Greek power for a generation. He can finish this the brutal, traditional way. Close in, surround the survivors, and kill as many Spartans as the afternoon allows. Maximize the body count. Send a message written in blood. Or he can do something far more devastating. Something that will wound Sparta not in its flesh, but in its soul. He looks at the shattered remnants of the army that once owned Greece. Surrounded. Spent. Waiting for the blade to fall. And instead of delivering the killing blow, he decides to let them live with what just happened. In the next part of this story, we will see how Epaminondas turned victory into a weapon that kept cutting long after the last spear was pulled from the ground, forcing Sparta to publicly count its dead, to beg for the return of its fallen, and to watch the laws and identity that had sustained it for centuries crack apart under the weight of a single afternoon at Leuctra. The Spartans still breathing at Leuctra are surrounded. They scan the field and see Theban spear points closing in from 3 directions. Behind them, the ground is carpeted with the dead. Most of those dead are wearing the same crimson cloaks they are. Their king is somewhere among them. By every convention of Greek warfare, this is the moment when the victors tighten the ring, lower their spears, and finish what they started. No quarter, no survivors. That is not what Epaminondas does. He does something far more cruel. He stops. A Theban trumpet cuts through the noise. The front ranks halt their advance. The screaming fades into a ragged animal moaning. The Spartans brace for a final charge that never arrives. Instead, a lone figure steps forward under a flag of truce. The terms are simple and merciless. If the Spartans want their dead back, they have to ask for them. In the Greek world, this is not a technicality. It is a verdict. An unwritten law governs every battlefield in this civilization. The army that holds the ground when the fighting ends is the winner. The army that sends a herald to request permission to collect its fallen has publicly, irrevocably admitted defeat. That single act, walking across the field and making the request, is the formal declaration of loss. Until this afternoon, Sparta has almost always been the one granting that request, not making it. Inside the Spartan camp, the decision tears them apart. Their king is lying out there in the sun. Hundreds of their finest citizens are rotting on Boeotian soil. Leaving them unburied would violate every sacred obligation a Greek held dear. But sending an envoy to beg the Theban general for permission means saying, out loud, in front of every ally and every enemy, that Sparta has been defeated in the open field. They have no alternative. A Spartan envoy crosses the blood-soaked ground toward the Theban lines. You can feel the weight of every stare that follows him. Theban soldiers, battered but triumphant, line the path. They are watching the living representative of a shattered legend walk into their camp to ask for mercy. Epaminondas waits, composed, flanked by officers who have spent their entire lives fearing the very nation this man speaks for. The herald delivers the request: a truce to recover the dead. But Epaminondas catches the wording. The initial phrasing, according to later accounts, is deliberately vague. The Spartans frame the request as coming from the Allied coalition as a whole, not from Sparta specifically. A small, desperate attempt to dilute the shame. To spread the admission of defeat across many shoulders instead of placing it squarely on Spartan ones. Epaminondas refuses to accept it. He makes them say it correctly. He makes them ask as Sparta. Only when the herald states plainly that Sparta itself is requesting the truce does Epaminondas agree. The record is now official and permanent. Thebes has defeated Sparta, not only in combat, but in ceremony, in protocol, in the formal language that every city in Greece will repeat for the rest of the century. And the humiliation is only beginning. Under the terms of the truce, Spartan and allied soldiers move onto the field to gather their dead. Theban troops stand aside and observe. What Epaminondas orchestrates next transforms a grim but ordinary task into a deliberate act of psychological demolition. He orders the bodies sorted, Spartans on one side, allies on the other. On one section of the field, the corpses of full Spartan citizens are laid out in rows. On another, the bodies of allied soldiers from the cities that followed Sparta into this fight. By forcing this separation, Epaminondas converts the battlefield into an open ledger, a public accounting of exactly how much Spartan blood was spilled on this ground. And the numbers are catastrophic. Ancient sources indicate that of roughly 700 Spartan citizens who marched to Leuctra, approximately 400 are dead. In any other city, this would be a devastating blow. In Sparta, with its uniquely tiny citizen population, it is an existential wound. The Spartan system rests on a small core of warrior citizens supported by a vast base of enslaved laborers and dependent populations. That core has just lost more than half its strength in a single afternoon. Epaminondas ensures that no one can look away from these numbers. Allied soldiers see the sorted dead. Boeotian troops see them. Neutral observers and travelers who will carry news from this field to every corner of Greece see them. They do not simply hear a rumor that Sparta lost. With their own eyes, the precise scale of the destruction. The city that was supposed to be untouchable suddenly looks hollow, fragile, finite. This is the audit of death. For 300 years, Sparta sustained its dominance through fear. Fear of its training, fear of its record, fear of its absolute refusal to show weakness. Epaminondas has found a way to turn Sparta's own dead into the most powerful argument against its mythology. As travel across Greece, they will inflict more damage than a decade of lost skirmishes. As the Spartans carry their fallen from the field, the Thebans raise a monument, a stone column near the site of the battle. Not merely a memorial for the dead, a permanent marker that announces to every traveler who passes for the rest of time, this is the place where Sparta was broken. Every year, every decade, every century, people will walk past this spot and remember what happened here. It deepens when the news reaches Sparta itself. The city is in the middle of a sacred festival when the messenger arrives. Rituals are underway. Sacrifices are being made. In any other Greek city, news of a catastrophe this severe would shatter the celebration instantly. People would abandon ceremonies. They would tear their garments. They would fill the streets with open weeping. Sparta is not any other city. When it reaches the ephors, the city's ruling magistrates, they refuse to let the festival be visibly disrupted. They absorb the information in private. The king is dead. Hundreds of citizens are gone. The army has been defeated on open ground. Then they issue an order that reveals just how deeply the Spartan system has warped the people living inside it. No public mourning. Spartan custom dictates that open grief for men killed in battle is forbidden. Who dies fighting is supposed to be a source of pride, not sorrow. The only families permitted to weep in public are those whose sons came home alive in disgrace. After Leuctra, this rule transforms the entire city into a theater of inverted grief. Picture it. The news moves from household to household. Mothers learn that their sons are dead. Wives learn that their husbands are never coming home. Every natural instinct screams at them to collapse, to scream, to tear their hair. Stands above them, cold and immovable. The state demands that they appear in public with composed faces, even with expressions of satisfaction, as proof that Sparta remains unbroken. Some ancient writers describe a scene that borders on the surreal. The mothers of men who fell at Leuctra emerge from their homes with straight spines and steady eyes. Some display a kind of grim pride. Their sons held the line. Their sons did not run. That is supposed to be the correct response. The survivors, meanwhile, lower their heads. They cover their faces. They are the ones who carry the visible shame. Their sons came back alive from a battle Sparta lost. If there is even a whisper of doubt about their courage, the entire family absorbs the disgrace. This is not resilience. This is a society consuming itself. Behind closed doors, the reality must be unbearable. Parents who want to mourn cannot. Who want to rage at the generals who led their husbands into a trap must swallow every word. The entire city is commanded to perform the fiction that this disaster validates their values rather than exposing the cost of them. But in the quiet spaces, in the whispered conversations behind walls, the mask is already cracking. People are beginning to ask whether the system they have sacrificed everything to uphold is worth what it demands. Who survived Leuctra, the homecoming is its own kind of horror. Sparta has a designation for those who display fear in battle. Tresantes, the tremblers. To be branded a trembler is to die while still breathing. You lose your citizenship. You are forced to wear a specially marked cloak that advertises your disgrace to everyone you pass. You may be compelled to shave part of your beard in a degrading pattern. Anyone can insult you in public without consequence. Become a walking monument to cowardice, a living reminder of what Sparta does to those who break. After Leuctra, the pool of potential tremblers is larger than it has ever been. Not every survivor was a coward. Many fought with everything they had and simply drew the luck of not being killed. But in the chaos of a collapsing phalanx, no one can verify every individual action. Rumors move faster than truth. This man was seen turning his back. That one was spotted without his shield. In the wrong position when the line disintegrated. In a system as rigid as Sparta's, context is irrelevant. The law does not ask why. It only asks what happened. But now Sparta faces a paradox that threatens to destroy it from the inside. So many citizens are dead that the city cannot afford to discard the survivors as well. The military system that defines Spartan identity depends on maintaining a critical mass of trained warriors. Of its best men buried in Boeotian soil, the army is dangerously depleted. If they apply the law of the tremblers to every man whose behavior at Leuctra can be questioned, they will cripple their own fighting strength for a generation or more. This is where the defeat reaches past the battlefield and wraps its fingers around the throat of Spartan identity itself. Their laws. Basileus, the elder Spartan king who was not present at Leuctra but still wields enormous political power, confronts an impossible dilemma. The ancient code says the law is absolute. A coward is cast out permanently. No exceptions, no appeals. But the new arithmetic is brutal. Sparta needs living bodies that know how to fight. The world has just learned, in the most public way imaginable, that Spartan manpower is not limitless. Agesilaus does something that previous generations of Spartans would have considered sacrilege. He bends the law. Later writers describe a moment where the ironclad rule against rehabilitating men judged as cowards is quietly suspended. Some sources characterize it with a phrase that cuts to the bone. For one day, the laws of Lycurgus would sleep. The city reclassifies some of its survivors. It adjusts its own categories. Ways to reabsorb men it would once have permanently destroyed. That phrase matters more than any battle casualty. It is a confession that the system is no longer untouchable. For centuries, Sparta told Greece and told itself that its laws were perfect, eternal, handed down by a semi-divine lawgiver and never to be altered under any circumstances. Now, under the pressure of a single defeat, those laws bend. And if they can bend once, the entire foundation cracks. If Lycurgus can be suspended when it becomes inconvenient, then it was never divine. It was just a rule enforced by men and breakable by men. Epaminondas has not merely killed Spartans. He has forced them to betray the story they tell about themselves. You could close the book here, and Leuctra would already rank among the most devastating defeats in ancient history. A king dead, a citizen army gutted, sacred laws twisted to cover the wound. But Epaminondas is not finished. And something that separates true strategic vision from simple battlefield brilliance. Sparta's real power was never just its hoplites. It was the invisible infrastructure underneath them. The helots. For centuries, the Spartans had maintained their warrior lifestyle by ruling over an enormous population of enslaved laborers, concentrated especially in Messenia, the rich agricultural region to the west. Worked the fields, harvested the grain, and produced the surplus that allowed Spartan citizens to spend their entire lives training for war instead of farming for food. They were systematically brutalized, humiliated, terrorized by a secret police apparatus designed to crush any hint of rebellion before it could organize. Everyone in Greece understood that if the Helots ever revolted in large enough numbers, Sparta would face an existential crisis. Imagine being a Helot in the weeks and months after Leuctra. You hear that the undefeatable Spartan army was broken by Thebans. You hear that the king himself was killed on the field. You hear that entire units of Spartan citizens never came home. The terror that has kept you obedient for your entire life, that kept your parents obedient, that kept your grandparents obedient, is beginning to dissolve. Powerful enough arrives to shatter your chains. Are you going to fight them off? Epaminondas sees the opening and drives straight through it. In the years following Leuctra, he leads Theban-led coalition armies deep into the Peloponnese, the Spartan homeland. In 370 and 369 BC, he accomplishes something that no hostile force had managed in recorded Greek history. He marches into Laconia itself. For centuries, Sparta had kept every enemy army at a distance. The military reputation and the sheer psychological weight of the Spartan name had formed an invisible barrier that no invader dared to cross. That barrier no longer exists. Spartan citizens watch from their unwalled city as enemy campfires dot their own landscape. Villages burn. Fields that had never felt a foreign boot are trampled by Theban soldiers, are forced onto the defensive for the first time in collective memory, pulled back to protect their own homes instead of projecting power outward. The image of Sparta as an impenetrable fortress that danger never reaches is extinguished. But Epaminondas is not content with invasion. He goes after the root. He marches to Messinia, home, and the surrounding sites. He helps the Messenian population, people who had lived as helots under Spartan domination for generations, construct a new fortified city, Messene. He gathers exiles and rebels, provides military backing, and declares their independence. The helots of Messenia are no longer Spartan property. They are free citizens of a new state, protected by walls thick enough to resist siege and by alliances strong enough to deter retaliation. This is not symbolism, economic annihilation. By liberating Messinia, Epaminondas rips out the agricultural and labor foundation that has sustained the Spartan way of life for centuries. The fields that grew the grain that fed Spartiate households now feed a different people. The forced labor that allowed Spartan citizens to train full-time for war is gone. Without their helot workforce, the Spartans can no longer maintain the lifestyle that produced their warriors. They must work their own land, just to a world where resources are finite and leisure is no longer guaranteed. They become poorer, they become weaker, and the decline accelerates with every passing year. He performs a similar operation in Arcadia, helping to establish the fortified city of Megalopolis as a permanent counterweight to Spartan influence in the central Peloponnese. Everywhere Epaminondas moves, he is not simply winning engagements, drawing the political map of Greece in ways designed to ensure that Spartan dominance can never reconstitute itself. This is the architecture of total humiliation. First, shatter the army in open combat. Then, force the defeated to formally acknowledge their loss in the ritual language of Greek warfare. Then, sort the dead into piles and show the world exactly how much irreplaceable blood was spilled. Apply enough pressure to make their sacred, supposedly eternal laws bend and break. And finally, march into their homeland and liberate the enslaved population whose labor made the entire Spartan system possible. After all of this, Sparta still exists. The city is not razed. Its temples still stand. Its name still carries a fading echo of the old terror. But the substance beneath the name is gone. Sparta will never again be the undisputed military hegemon of Greece, as a shadow of what it was, trading on a reputation that the rest of the world now knows is hollow. And what becomes of Epaminondas? He does not build a personal empire. He does not declare himself king or tyrant. He remains what he has always been, a citizen general of Thebes, called to command when the city needs him, and returning to ordinary life when the campaign ends. 62 BC, at the Battle of Mantinea, he leads another coalition against a combined force that includes Spartans and their new partners. Once again, he wins. Once again, his tactics prove superior. But this time, victory takes everything from him. During the fighting, a spear strikes him in the chest and lodges deep near his heart. His men carry him from the field. The surgeons examine the wound and deliver the verdict he already knows. The spearhead is buried too deep. Will almost certainly kill him. Leaving it in will kill him slowly. Epaminondas, fully aware of what is happening, asks one question: did we win? When they tell him the enemy is in retreat, he tells them to pull the spear out. He dies shortly after. Ancient writers record that someone told him in his final moments that he had no sons to continue his name. His supposed answer has echoed through 24 centuries. He was leaving behind 2 daughters, Leuctra and Mantinea. Those exact words left his lips. The meaning is unmistakable. His legacy is not a bloodline. It is a revolution in how wars are fought and how myths are destroyed. Thebes itself will not hold the summit for long. Within a generation, a new force will rise from the north. Philip II of Macedon, who spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, will study the innovations Epaminondas pioneered, absorb them, and refine them further with longer spears and heavier cavalry. Alexander will carry that evolved system across 3 continents and reshape the world. But none of that erases what happened on a dusty plain in Boeotia in 351 BC. One man looked at the most feared military machine in the Greek world and refused to accept the story it told about itself. Sparta not as an invincible force, but as a system built by humans. Formations that could be outmaneuvered, laws that could be pressured, rituals that could be exploited, and myths that could be killed. Then he went after every single one of those components, systematically, without mercy, until nothing was left but the name. He did not just defeat Sparta, exposed it, humiliated it, and then dismantled the foundations that had made its power possible in the first place. Epaminondas proved that the deadliest weapon on any battlefield is not a sharper spear or a thicker shield. It is a superior idea, executed without hesitation, aimed directly at the story your enemy believes about who they are. Filled with moments like this, sudden collapses where a power everyone assumed was invincible is dragged down in a single, shocking reversal. So here is where I want to hear from you. Which military defeat do you think was even more humiliating than what Sparta suffered at Leuctra? Head to the pinned comment right now. I have left a question there designed to change how we think about ancient warfare. Drop your answer, argue your case, and see what others are saying. This one out in the comments. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If you felt that shift in your chest when the Spartan myth cracked open, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who still believes that any power in history was truly untouchable. On your screen right now, there is a new episode waiting for you. Click it and keep going. Do not stop here. To understand how dark, brutal, and strange our past really was, that video is your mandatory next chapter. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on